July 1, 1946, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. The lagoon is calm, the sky impossibly blue. Dozens of warships rest in silence. American, Japanese, and German awaiting a new kind of weapon. At 8:59 a.m., a B-29 superfortress releases an atomic bomb, codenamed Able. The ocean turns to fire. 95 ships vanish beneath a rising cloud, a mushroom of steam and dust stretching 5 miles high. Weeks later, a second detonation beaker erupts beneath the sea, lifting millions of tons of water and coral into the air. The shock wave tears through the fleet. Radiation rains back down, poisoning everything it touches. The islanders, exiled for the tests, never returned. Their soil, coconuts, and fish remain contaminated by cesium and plutonium. Beneath the lagoon now lies a fleet of rusting relics: the USS Saratoga, the Arkansas, the Nagato, entombed in silence. Today, the water glows with life, but carries death in its memory. A paradise turned mausoleum, where the sea itself remembers the bomb. But the truth goes deeper. Watch the full story on Ghost of War. July 1, 1946, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. The morning light fell gently over the lagoon, a sheet of glass reflecting the endless Pacific sky. Palm trees swayed in air heavy with salt and humidity. For the people of Bikini, it was a day like any other, except for the ships that had appeared on their horizon vast, steel giants resting silently on turquoise waters. From the coral shoreline, a woman named Lejon Eknilang stood with her father, watching the fleet anchored in the lagoon. She was 20 years old, barefoot on white sand that had always been hers. Behind her, smoke rose from thatched cooking huts. Children laughed, splashing in the shallows. But the men who had come from America, men in khaki uniforms, with cameras and clipboards, told them this would no longer be their home. They spoke of something called Operation Crossroads, 2 explosions. They said, tests, to learn the power of the atomic bomb, the same weapon that had turned Hiroshima and Nagasaki into ash less than a year ago. The Americans promised they would be allowed to return once the tests were over. For the good of mankind, they said. Lejon's father had nodded slowly, not understanding. Few of the islanders spoke English, but they knew fear when they saw it in the silence of the officers, in the urgency of their work, in the way they avoided meeting the islanders' eyes. At dawn, the U.S. Navy began its preparations. Anchored in the lagoon were 95 warships, Japanese, German, and American, captured, decommissioned, and awaiting their fate. The USS Saratoga, USS Arkansas, the Japanese cruiser Sakawa, all lined up like ghosts of past wars, waiting to be reborn in fire. Over 42,000 personnel were stationed around the atoll: scientists, sailors, photographers, and reporters. Their mission to witness the marriage of the atom and the sea. The ships were rigged with test animals, goats, pigs, and rats, their fur marked with white paint. Cameras were mounted to record the instant of impact. Dosimeters lined the decks. Every cable, every gauge, every inch of metal would tell the story of the bomb's reach. That morning, Lejon's people began to pack. They loaded their few possessions: fishing nets, carved canoes, woven mats onto naval landing crafts. An elder named Judah stood before an American officer and asked, through a translator, how long they would be gone. The officer smiled. "You will return soon," he said. "After the tests are complete." They were taken to Rongerik Atoll, 125 miles away, a smaller, less fertile island from the ship. Legion looked back at Bikini. The lagoon shimmered beneath the rising sun. The ships lay still, their steel hulls glinting like scales of sleeping monsters. She whispered a prayer not for the Americans, not for the warships, but for the sea itself. At 8:59 a.m., the countdown began. Across the observation fleet, sailors donned protective goggles and turned away. In the distance, a single B-29 superfortress circled above the lagoon, its belly open. Inside, the bomb codenamed Able awaited release. The sky was blue, impossibly clear. Seagulls cut across the horizon. The pilot's voice came over the radio, calm and precise. Able is away. For 43 seconds, the world held its breath. Then, at 520 feet above the fleet, the bomb detonated. A sphere of light erupted, white, blinding, absolute. It burned across the sky like a second sun. The shockwave flattened waves into vapor. The air turned to flame. On the decks of the nearest ships, paint boiled, steel twisted. The USS Gilliam vanished in less than a second. The USS Carlisle split in half. From the observation ships 20 miles away, men stared in silence. Cameras rattled on their mounts. Through the blinding glare, the lagoon disappeared beneath a boiling cloud of fire and steam. A column of smoke rose 5 miles into the air, crowned by a halo of dust and water vapor, the first atomic mushroom cloud ever seen over the ocean. Legion, watching from Rongerik, saw the sky turn white. Moments later, a low, rolling thunder reached her island. The sea receded for an instant, as if the ocean itself had exhaled. No one knew that in that instant. Every grain of sand, every coral head, every drop of water within miles had been filled with death too small to see. July 25, 1946, 24 days after Able. The second test, codenamed Baker, would not fall from the sky. This time, the bomb was lowered into the sea. At dawn, the lagoon was quiet again, eerily so. The sun filtered through a thin mist rising from the ocean's surface, turning the anchored ships into ghostly silhouettes. A diver's platform bobbed near the USS Saratoga, the massive aircraft carrier that had survived the first blast. At its center hung the bomb, a 23-kiloton device named Helen of Bikini, suspended 90 feet beneath the waterline. The official name of the operation was still Crossroads, but for many of the men who had watched Able, the word had already changed meaning. They spoke in low voices now, no longer with the excitement of scientists and soldiers at the frontier of discovery, but with a wary respect. Some called it simply the Beast. As the countdown began, the fleet sat waiting in the still lagoon. 95 vessels, silent witnesses to a test that none of them would survive. On their decks, the remains of test animals waited once again, locked in cages, strapped to railings. Some were still alive. Radiation burns scabbing their hides from the first detonation. Scientists wanted data on the effects of underwater shockwaves. They wanted numbers, not screams. At exactly 8:35, the lagoon erupted. The sea exploded upward in a single, monstrous column. Millions of tons of water rose in a roaring white pillar half a mile wide, carrying with it the ships, the air, the light. A ring of vapor rolled outward, like a tidal wave made of clouds. Those who watched from distant observation decks said it looked like the ocean itself had been torn open. The USS Saratoga was lifted from the sea, thrown into the air, and slammed down again. The USS Arkansas disappeared beneath the boiling foam. The Japanese cruiser Sakawa was ripped apart, its hull folding inward like paper. Within seconds, the entire lagoon became a storm of metal, fire, and radioactive mist. From the air, it looked like a wound, a perfect circle carved into the blue of the Pacific. The detonation had vaporized over 2 million tons of seawater, coral, and sand, transforming the lagoon into a cloud of glowing death. Radioactive debris rained down across the atoll for hours. The air shimmered with fine dust that no one could see, touch, or breathe without consequence. On the observation ships, sailors watched in stunned silence. Some cheered out of instinct, as if witnessing victory, but others turned away. They felt the heat through their protective gear. They tasted metal on their tongues. They saw the rain falling from the sky thick, oily droplets that hissed when they struck the deck. The instruments went wild. Geiger counters crackled beyond their scales. Cameras fogged over with radiation. When boats were finally sent into the lagoon, hours later, the water itself seemed alive, churning, luminous, as if breathing in slow motion. They found the USS Saratoga still afloat, its massive frame smoldering. Dead fish covered the surface of the lagoon, thousands upon thousands, floating belly up. The test animals, what was left of them, were retrieved by men wearing lead-lined suits. Most were already dead. Those that lived did not last the night. When the decontamination began, the Navy realized something terrifying. No amount of scrubbing, washing, or repainting could remove the invisible residue that clung to every surface. Radiation had seeped into the very metal of the ships. The lagoon itself had become a cauldron of death. For days, sailors tried to clean the vessels. They climbed the decks of the USS Independence and the USS Prince Eugen with hoses and brushes, unaware that each minute they spent inhaling the air around them was poisoning their blood. Within weeks, the cleanup crews began reporting burns, nausea, and hair loss. The Navy tried to continue testing, but the contamination spread faster than anyone could contain it. The ships began to corrode, their hulls glowing faintly under ultraviolet light. One by one, they were scuttled, sunk deliberately in the lagoon they had once defied, entombed beneath the same waters that had birthed the atomic age. And so, the lagoon fell silent again. But it was no longer the silence of paradise. It was the silence of aftermath, heavy, invisible, irreversible. Far away, on Rongerik Atoll, Leon Eknilang and her people waited. They looked out at the horizon each morning, hoping for the ship that would bring them home. But the ships never came. The coconuts on Rongerik were small and bitter. The fish grew scarce. Hunger began to whisper in every hut. Lijon's father told her to pray. She did. But her prayers, like the waves that broke endlessly on the reef, reached only as far as the poisoned horizon. A year had passed since the bombs. The lagoon had grown quiet again, its surface calm, concealing the graveyard beneath. From above, Bikini still looked like a dream, a crescent of white sand and palms framed by turquoise water, but the air shimmered faintly, even on windless days. Birds no longer nested in the trees. The coconuts that fell to the sand carried an unseen poison. On Rongerik Atoll, hunger had become a daily companion. Leon Eknilang awoke each morning to the sound of her younger brother coughing, his ribs sharp beneath his skin. The sea that once gave them life now betrayed them. The fish tasted bitter, and the breadfruit trees bore no fruit. When the Americans visited to bring supplies, the people gathered around them in silence, their eyes hollow, their bodies thin. The U.S. officials brought canned food and promises. They assured the Bikinians that soon they would return home as soon as the scientists finished their measurements. But those measurements told a truth they did not share. The coral, the sand. Even the rain had been touched by cesium, strontium, and plutonium. The lagoon that once held life now held the echo of a son's heart. In the laboratories at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, data poured in. Operation Crossroads had yielded valuable information. The Baker test, in particular, had revealed the near impossibility of decontaminating a fleet after an underwater nuclear blast. Memos described it clinically. Surface contamination remains persistent. Metallic corrosion observed in hull plating. Prolonged exposure hazardous to personnel. But in those lines of text, there was no mention of the people of Bikini. By 1948, the Navy had abandoned the test fleet entirely. Most of the remaining ships, the Saratoga, the Arkansas, the Nagato, the Apagon, lay rusting beneath 200 feet of water, forming a silent armada beneath the sea. Divers who descended into the lagoon years later would describe them as ships asleep in death, their decks littered with instruments, cables, and the remains of experiments. But the Bikinians knew nothing of this. They only knew that their exile stretched on. In 1949, a delegation was brought to Kwajalein, where American officials announced that Rongerik was no longer sustainable. The people cheered, thinking they were going home. Instead, they were moved again. This time to Kili Island, a place with no lagoon, no fish, and waves too rough for their canoes. Their seafaring heritage ended there, on that barren rock. Lion was 23. Her father died that year, his body thin and dry as driftwood. She buried him beneath a young coconut tree that would never bear fruit. The elders spoke of curses, of angry spirits. The young spoke of America, of the island they had lost. Meanwhile, at Bikini, the U.S. continued to study the wrecks. Scientists in rubber suits collected coral samples and seawater, their Geiger counters ticking steadily. The atoll had become a living laboratory, a monument to the atomic age. In 1954, the tests returned. Operation Castle, the hydrogen bomb. Bravo. The largest nuclear explosion ever detonated by the United States, 1,000 times more powerful than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima. It turned the sky white again, and the cloud it left behind stretched 130,000 feet into the air. The fallout drifted for miles over Rongelap, over Rongerik, over Utrecht. Islanders watched the white ash fall from the sky, thinking it was snow. They touched it, tasted it. It burned their skin and turned their hair white. Children cried as blisters appeared across their bodies. Lijon, then 30, saw the boats return again, this time not with supplies, but with masks, Geiger counters, and the smell of disinfectant. They told the people not to drink the water, not to eat the food, not to touch the soil. But there was nothing else to live on. Within weeks, rashes spread across the villages, women miscarried, men coughed blood. The Americans called it radiation sickness. The islanders called it the invisible fire. Years later, when the tests ended and the scientists left, Lijon stood once more on the beach of Bikini. The lagoon looked the same, still, blue, and endless, but it was no longer hers. The Geiger counter in the scientist's hand clicked rapidly. "Not safe," he said. She looked out at the water where her father had once fished, where her ancestors had sung to the sea gods. Beneath that water now lay a fleet of dead ships, the Arkansas, the Saratoga, the Nagato, all sleeping under layers of coral and thyme, glowing faintly in the dark. The Americans called them the Ghost Fleet, but to Leon, they were tombs of steel, of memory, of home. As the sun sank behind the atoll, the water shimmered gold. The lagoon seemed peaceful, almost holy. But beneath that peace lay the silence of everything that had been sacrificed the land. the people, the sea itself, for the sake of knowledge. And in that silence, the ocean still held its breath. Bikini Lagoon, 1963. 18 years after the first bomb, the world above had moved on from the atomic age to the space race. But beneath the waters of the Marshall Islands, time stood still. At 180 feet below the surface, in a twilight of green-blue haze, the USS Saratoga slept on the ocean floor. Her deck was half buried in silt, her steel flight tower draped in coral. Fish swam through shattered hangars once filled with fighter planes. Rusting cables hung like vines. Every sound was muted, the slow pulse of the ocean, the faint creak of collapsing bulkheads. The divers called it a cathedral of ghosts. They came wearing lead-lined suits, air tanks, and waterproof Geiger counters, their bubbles spiraling upward through shafts of light. Every time a diver brushed a surface, the counter crackled faintly, a reminder that the sea here was not clean, not innocent. In 1964, a team from the U.S. Navy Radiological Defense Laboratory conducted one of the first underwater surveys of the wrecks. The goal was to measure how radiation behaved in a marine environment over time. But what they found was something else entirely, a submerged necropolis, preserved by salt and silence. The USS Arkansas lay upside down, her massive hull a rusted mountain of twisted metal. The Japanese cruiser Sakawa was torn open from bow to stern, her gun turrets scattered like bones. The German submarine Prinz Eugen had drifted off to nearby Kwajalein, where it later capsized and sank another relic, another casualty. In the stillness of the lagoon, human artifacts remained untouched: a pair of boots on a deck, a coffee mug half buried in silt, the faint outline of painted letters on a bulkhead test area 7. The divers described it as haunting, almost reverent. One of them, Commander Robert F. Dinsmore, later wrote in his field notes, "It feels like stepping into a tomb. Everything is preserved, but nothing lives. The sea here remembers everything." But even as the scientists descended, the people of Bikini remained exiled. The U.S. had promised them resettlement, and in 1968 that promise came again. After years of study, government officials declared Bikini safe for limited habitation. Lijan Eknilang was now in her 40s. She had children of her own, and all she wanted was to see her home again. When the Navy ships brought them back, she wept as she stepped onto the white sand, the same sand she had left as a girl. The palms had grown wild, the huts were gone, but the lagoon, shimmering under the sun, was unchanged. For a while, they tried to rebuild. New houses were built from concrete. Coconuts were planted. Fishing resumed. The laughter of children returned to the beach. But soon, the sickness began again. Geiger counters brought by visiting scientists clicked constantly. The coconuts, when tested, contained strontium-90 and cesium-137 isotopes that mimicked calcium in the human body, lodging in bones and milk. The fish were contaminated. The soil itself emitted a low, steady hum of radiation. Lijan's neighbor, a young mother, miscarried twice. Another woman gave birth to a stillborn child with fused limbs. The elders began to whisper that the land was cursed, but the curse was man-made, and its name was fallout. In 1978, the U.S. evacuated the Bikinians again, this time permanently. Scientists concluded that radiation in the island's ecosystem was 75 times higher than safe limits. The people were relocated to Majuro, then to Kili once more, and once again, they watched their homeland disappear behind the horizon. Lijan never saw Bikini again. Decades later, divers and historians would return to the lagoon not as conquerors or scientists, but as witnesses. National Geographic teams, documentary filmmakers, and environmental researchers descended into the ghostly blue, cameras tracing the outlines of battleships that had once ruled the world. Inside the Saratoga, coral now bloomed where men once walked. Schools of fish darted through rusted hangars. Light filtered through shattered windows, falling across decks littered with relics of vanished war helmets, shells, and a single oxygen mask still hanging on its hook. The divers spoke in hushed tones. They knew they were swimming not through a shipwreck, but through a graveyard, a place where science had tested its limits and humanity had crossed its own. And though the water was clear, nothing in it was clean. The coral glowed faintly under ultraviolet light, absorbing the atom's signature, carrying it silently through generations of marine life. The lagoon had become an ecosystem built on contamination, a paradox of beauty born from ruin. At night, from above, the atoll looked serene again. The palms swayed. The surf whispered against the sand. But beneath that calm, under 200 feet of living water, the ghosts of war still slept silent, preserved, and waiting for the world to remember what it had buried. Bikini Atoll, 1985. The water was still impossibly clear, the color of melted glass. Sunlight poured through the lagoon like liquid fire, illuminating the skeletal silhouettes of warships long forgotten by their makers. Yet even in beauty, there was something unearthly, a faint metallic taste to the air, a stillness that seemed to hum beneath the surface. By then, the ghost fleet had become a legend among divers, a forbidden cathedral of the atomic age. Those who came spoke of awe and sorrow in the same breath. Some descended to see history with their own eyes. Others came seeking silence in the graveyard of machines. Each dive began the same way, a long descent through calm water, the pressure building in the chest, the light fading to a spectral blue. Then the shape of a hull emerging from the void, massive, black, and still. The USS Saratoga. Divers floated past her rusted guns, her flight deck draped in sea fans, her command tower rising like a cathedral spire. The silence was immense. The ocean had claimed her gently, not as plunder, but as penance. But even now, Geiger counters still whispered their warning. The sediment on the lagoon floor held the memory of plutonium and cesium. The coral itself pulsed faintly with radiation too faint to kill, but enough to mark this place as forever changed. The ocean had learned to live with its poison. Far from the lagoon, the Bikinians lived scattered across the Marshall Islands, a people without a homeland. Some had settled on Kili, others on Majuro or Ibeyi. They built houses of tin and concrete, spoke English in the schools built by aid programs, and raised children who had never seen the island their ancestors had called home. Lion Eknilang was now an old woman. Her hands were thin, her eyes clouded but sharp. In interviews, her voice carried both dignity and pain. The Americans told us we were chosen, that God had chosen us to help stop war. But what kind of God asks you to leave your home, to die slowly, and never return? Her words would echo through congressional hearings decades later, as the United States faced growing pressure to reckon with the human cost of its atomic experiments. Between 1946 and 1958, the U.S. had detonated 67 nuclear weapons across the Marshall Islands, a combined explosive yield of 108 megatons, equivalent to 7,200 Hiroshima bombs. Entire atolls were vaporized. Others were rendered uninhabitable for centuries. The Bikinians, numbering barely 160 when they were first displaced, had become a diaspora, their population scattered, their lineage altered by radiation and exile. In 1990, the Bikini Council filed a petition with the U.S. government, demanding reparations and the right to return. scientists conducted renewed surveys of the atoll. The results were quietly devastating. While radiation in the air and water had decreased, the soil remained highly contaminated. Cesium-137 lingered in every coconut, every breadfruit, every fish in the lagoon. One report, written in sterile scientific language, concluded, "A return to Bikini cannot be safely recommended for at least several human generations." The words fell like a sentence. By then, nature had begun its slow reclamation. Coconut palms grew thick along the beaches. Sea turtles nested undisturbed. Coral reefs bloomed in surreal abundance, feeding on the bones of warships and the residue of the atom. The lagoon, paradoxically, had become one of the most pristine and biologically rich ecosystems on Earth, a paradise made toxic. Tourists arrived in the late 1990s, drawn by the forbidden beauty of the ghost fleet. They dove among the wrecks with high-definition cameras and called it the world's ultimate dive site. But beneath the fascination lay the quiet tragedy of what they swam through a graveyard where war, science, and innocence had all drowned together on clear nights under a sky filled with stars. The water of Bikini Lagoon shimmered faintly, a trick of the moonlight, or perhaps something else. Those who had lived here once said it was the spirits of their ancestors, still wandering the lagoon that had been stolen from them. Lijon Eknilang died in 2012 on Majuro, thousands of miles from the home she never regained. In her final years, she gave testimony to the United Nations, describing her people's suffering not with anger, but with a quiet plea. "We are the people of Bikini. We are like the fish that cannot live without the sea. Take us from our island, and we die slowly, not from hunger, but from longing." Today, her voice lingers in recordings, soft, deliberate, the tone of someone carrying both truth and grief. And still, beneath the waves, the ships remain. The Saratoga, the Arkansas, the Nagato monuments, not to war, but to what war leaves behind. Coral wraps their guns. Sea life thrives in their shadow. They rest in silence, surrounded by the invisible ghosts of radiation, memory, and consequence. Above them, the ocean continues to breathe, calm, indifferent, eternal. Bikini Atoll, present day. The world has forgotten the name. It survives mostly in the echo of a swimsuit brand, a cruel irony born from the very word bikini, which once meant home, life, and belonging. From the air, the atoll still looks like a paradise lost, a perfect ring of blue and green in the middle of the Pacific, untouched by human hands for decades. But beneath that postcard beauty lies a silence that hums with history. Radiation lingers in the soil. The palm trees grow tall, their roots drinking from poisoned ground. The air smells clean, but the ghosts never left. Marine biologists who dive here today describe an ecosystem both beautiful and unsettling. Giant corals bloom over gun turrets. Sea fans unfurl across flight decks. Sharks glide through the wreckage of the Saratoga, their sleek bodies illuminated by shafts of filtered light. Life, it seems, has reclaimed what death abandoned. Yet every reading tells the same story. Traces of cesium and plutonium still whisper from the seabed. They have entered the food chain: plankton, fish, coral, all pulsing faintly with the memory of the atom. The half-life of cesium-137 is 30 years. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,000. In the language of science, this place is decaying. In the language of the Bikinians, it is cursed. A few of the island's descendants still visit, ferried in on small boats by researchers or journalists. They do not stay long. They bring flowers, sing hymns in Marshallese, and stand barefoot on the sand where their grandparents once lived. Then they leave before sunset. The silence at dusk is said to be unbearable, as if the island itself remembers their footsteps and grieves. In one of her final letters, written before her death, Legion Eknilang described a dream. I saw the lagoon again, calm and shining. The ships were gone. The water was clear. I could hear the laughter of my people. But when I woke, I realized it was not the future. It was the past, calling back to me. That dream now survives in documentaries and archives, a fragment of human testimony standing against the tide of forgetfulness. Every so often, the U.S. Department of Energy releases new reports. The numbers shift slightly, radiation down here, stable there, but the conclusion remains unchanged, not yet safe. The compensation funds trickle out, managed by committees and lawyers. Meanwhile, the children of Bikini grow up in cities far away, their identity carried in a name they cannot touch. At the edge of history, the lagoon endures as both wound and warning. Divers call it the silent museum of the nuclear age. Scientists call it an ecological paradox. But the people of Bikini, wherever they live now in Majuro, in Arkansas, in Oregon, simply call it home. And so the story circles back. As the ocean always does, the fleet that once symbolized power lies rusting beneath the waves. The nation that tested its might here long ago now sends tourists, not soldiers. The coral glows, the sea breathes, and somewhere in the deep, the Saratoga groans softly in her sleep, a reminder that no experiment truly ends. Above her, sunlight flickers on the water's surface, the same sunlight that once lit the faces of those who watched their island disappear beneath the white flash of the atom. No sound remains of that day, no witness but the sea. But if you listen closely, in the stillness between waves, you can almost hear it, the hum of the earth, remembering what it was made to forget. A song of steel, fire, and salt water composed in the silence of the world's first atomic sea. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 67 nuclear weapons across the Marshall Islands, a total explosive yield of 108 megatons, more than 7,200 times the power of Hiroshima. Bikini and Eniwetok bore the brunt of these tests, forever altering their ecosystems and their people. The residents of Bikini Atoll, 167 people displaced in 1946, became refugees in their own ocean. Many never returned. Studies conducted by the USS as Department of Energy in 2017 confirmed persistent contamination in soil and food sources, with radiation levels up to 1,000 times higher than background averages. The Bikini Resettlement Trust Fund was established in 1982, but its payments could not restore what was lost: an island, a language, a way of life built on the rhythm of tide and wind. Today, the wrecks beneath Bikini Lagoon are protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a paradox of beauty and sorrow. The coral thrives, the fish return, yet every fragment of that underwater kingdom still glows faintly with the residue of humanity's most terrible invention. And so, the ghost ships remain monuments to ambition, arrogance, and the unhealed wound between progress and consequence. Bikini Atoll sleeps beneath the waves, a paradise turned mausoleum. The sea above it gleams with impossible calm. And deep below, in the dark where sunlight cannot reach, the world's first atomic fleet continues its long, slow decay into silence.